that's just a little bit of background about creating that photo. Now, the other thing about this photo, for those who are just getting into that photography as well, is that I didn't do him smack bang in the middle. I didn't have him standing face onto the camera, the shop directly behind him, and him sitting in the middle of the picture. And this brings us on to the idea of what's commonly known as the rule of thirds. Now, those who haven't heard of it, you might be doing your photography, and this will, come as, oh, right, there's a whole new area I knew nothing about. Those who've been doing photography for any real length of time have sooner or later tended to hear of this. I tend to feel of it as a slightly unfortunate term because it's called rule of thirds as though it's a rule and you have to follow it. You certainly don't have to follow it. I would call it more of a guideline of thirds. So, what's the notion about thirds? The notion of thirds is that instead of having that photos very often work best, rather than when the main subject is dead center, but is off to one side. So if you were to divide this screen into 3, and then divide it into 3 another way, you would end up with a kind of noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe to my North American friends, grid. And this is such a popular understanding that you very often find in the backs of cameras. You can, in your viewfinder or your screen that you look at in the back, that you can flip on or off a little grid. And if I do this, I don't know, hopefully you can see that grid that's come on. What you notice here is that Andrew is just sort of running along this line here, rather than being in dead center. I suppose if I was to just move him into the center, now it's not really working because we've got this big white patch on the side, but it does change the feel of it a bit. Just having him slightly off to one side just creates a little bit more energy, a little bit more tension. So probably the best way to demonstrate this now is by using a much simpler photo. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip over to an old photo I took years ago. It's a lighthouse, little lighthouse at the end of a breakwater in Berwick upon Tweed, over in northwest England. Now, the important part of this, what I've done with the edit of this is, just to sort of make it less complicated, is I've pretty much smoothed out the sea and I've removed a chunk of beach that was just sitting in the foreground. So what we've got here is we've got a square and we've got a little key object sitting smack bang in the middle of the photo. And, it's fine. There's something reasonably pleasing about the photo. I think those kind of nice soft pastel colours. It was, beautiful pinks in the skies and the soft creamy blue in the bottom. But the lines are such that the sea and the sky divide exactly in the middle, and the lighthouse itself sits exactly in the middle. And it's okay, but you lose interest in it very quickly. The brain, it sort of evolved to notice things that are different, and or more specifically, it's evolved to filter out things that aren't. It filters out stuff that you're used to. It filters out things that you've kind of got the hang of. You think you know what you're doing already. So it's no longer necessary to use part of your brain power for it. So your brain just goes, okay, I don't need to worry about that. And you kind of forget it, ignore it. So when you have a photo which is exactly symmetrical or very symmetrical, it doesn't really hold the attention very much, because very quickly it's done everything it needs to do. Your brain can see, okay, big blank chunk of sea underneath, everything's even, there's not a lot to it, really. So if we want to create a bit more interest, maybe we can start playing with this rule of thirds. So what I want to do now, so if I go back to creating this grid, we can see that this is sitting here in the middle. But if I just drag this edge over to here, now it's off center. And somehow it slightly more grabs the attention. It emphasizes the breakwater coming out into the middle of the water, into the middle of the sea. Okay, let's undo that. Let's try it again, but actually pull in from the other side. Now, again, it's sitting off center, but there's much more emphasis on the sea. It feels like it's sort of just peeking out into a bigger ocean. So that's a kind of side to side, like we did with that picture of Andrew. We've cropped it a third away along, but you can also do thirds in terms of height. So if we take this down to here, now what happens is, again, we've got a much bigger emphasis on the sea, and then the lighthouse and breakwater are just kind of poking above it. It's got a different feel. So you can see the sky is taking the top third, the sea is now taking the bottom 2/3. And again, if we take this crop and we move this up to there, now the emphasis is much more about the sky. Your eye is drawn much more to the pink clouds behind it. So you can start to see then how where you're cropping it is already starting to change the story. We talked last week very much about how the crop can affect the story. Changes the mood to it. But we can go further with this. We can do, let's say, I want to come down a third here and come in a third here. So now we're really getting the sense of sea stretching out down the bottom of the picture. Likewise, we could bring this up and we could bring this in. Now again, much more about the sky. So you can start to see, I mean, already we've done about half a dozen or so different kinds of crops, and they all look slightly more interesting than this one. We can take it a bit further, whereby, let's say I really bring it up because I want to emphasize the narrowness of it, and then bring that down to something like that. Now, at that point, you probably zoom in. We've kind of got something that's a bit more like a banner in a way. So you've got this nice long stretch going on. Sense of those nice coloured patches in the sky has gone. So what we could do is do that another way. If we bring this up and bring this across. So essentially I just keep moving until it's hitting one of these little junctions here. And now everybody's got a slightly different preference, but for my money, this is probably my favourite crop of the lot. You've got a sense of the breakwater just streaming out into the sea. You've got the beautiful clouds behind. And so this is your rule of thirds. This is where this lighthouse is now sitting right on this junction of a third of the way across and a third of the way up. So in essence, that's what rule of thirds is about. You will hear it mentioned many times, but you have that noughts and crosses grid, that tic-tac-toe grid, and there are particular points, and if this sort of inside square, the corners of this inside square, So here, 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 and here. These become the kind of crucial points because they're a third of the way in and a third of the way up or down. And so if you place your key element in one of those spots, very often you find the whole photo just works that little bit better. Because it's not exactly even, because it's not exactly symmetrical, the brain starts going, oh, something's not quite right. It engages that little bit more. And the longer the brain is engaging with it, essentially the more successful the image is. So really, that's what I wanted to say about rule of thirds. It crops up all over the place. Now, in successive weeks as we go on, I will talk about entirely different ways of looking at photography, different compositional techniques when rule of thirds just isn't going to work. And so, yeah, hopefully keep tuning in. Subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube to make sure you can see future episodes. And come and follow me on Facebook if you're watching it live here. If you found this useful, let your friends know and hit subscribe.